Okay, so the recording has begun. I'm gonna let this play for a little bit to kind of catch up to back to where we were. So I believe where we left off was just after Jesus's temptation. And we talked a little bit about the peccability of Christ. And uh, I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about is, but before we kind of get into, so we're going to start today at verse 14 of chapter 1. And before we kind of get into that, I kind of after we were done talking last week, and the more that I thought about it, the more and more, because I was like, okay, these are like the baptism account is really quick, and so is the temptation account, like really quick, especially compared to like the other gospels and everything, like just kind of flying through it. And after I had made that point about the baptism being kind of like a picture of the incarnation itself, more I was reminded of that the temptation of Christ is actually very similar to it's very similar in what's happening to the passion of Christ, because what's happening is Jesus is going out to the outskirts, and he is engaging in spiritual warfare, right? And like, of course he is, because whenever, and you might think like, oh, no, he's not engaging in spiritual warfare, he's being tempted. Well, anytime you ask somebody like, oh man, I feel like I'm going through it right now, I feel like I'm being attacked, like kind of part of the things that they're talking about is like being tempted to do different things, right? And so like that being tempted kind of goes with that kind of spiritual attack. And ultimately what the cross is a picture of it is like kind of the evil forces of the world attacking Christ, and him flipping it back on himself and conquering their attack and winning. And so if you put these two stories back to back right together, you have a little fractal version of the whole gospel that's about to be like played out, right? You have a little mini like instance of the incarnation, and you have a little mini like instance of the passion, and like then boom, like everything is good and it goes forward. And right, since we've already seen this because we covered it so much in Genesis, it makes sense to us as to why like that would be there, because this is a thing that they do. You have like a mini fractal story that sets up the whole long story that is about to play out, and it kind of showcases and like foreshadows God's providence over the situation, right? And so that's what takes us to where Jesus says his like first line in Mark.
And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel."
Okay, right? So that statement that Jesus makes is paired with now after John was arrested. So what role is John playing? John's playing the role of like the herald, the person that comes beforehand and is preparing the way of the Lord. He's been arrested, which means his job as the herald is done. And so now, like, the king actually comes in and it's done. So repent and believe in the gospel. And like, what is he talking about? He's talking about that whole mini story that came beforehand, right? That whole mini story of began in the Old Testament with these prophecies and incarnation and defeat of spiritual, like the defeat of the enemy forces. And also, if you pay attention, right, he's coming from heaven, he's going down into baptism, and then he's going out into like the wilderness. And so, like a cosmic geography standpoint, he's covering everything. He's covering like all spaces. And so, because of that, like that's the path that Jesus takes, so he can take everybody in. And so now he's all but one, and he's just like going through motions, right? Of stuff that he has to do, and he's got to play out this path that's like laid before him, right? And he's got a mission, he's got stuff that he's going to do, but like you have that element that people talk about all the time, which is the already and not yet. Like even here in this like picture, it's kind of already like he's beaten Satan's temptation. So like, what else is there for them to beat? Well, the bigger portion, which is like the power of Satan, which is the actual death, which gets played out on the cross, right? But okay.
Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him.
Okay. So he Jesus begins his ministry. He's getting disciples, right? And he goes up and he asks, right? He asks them to become his disciples. And you got to understand that for the way that a traditional the like rabbinic system worked is not like this, right? The way that it worked is a rabbi like taught in a temple or in a synagogue, right? Because kind of anybody could like show up at like the different synagogues and like teach. And if like people were like impressed by what they were saying and wanted to become disciples of them, you would go up to them and you'd be like, "I'd like to be your disciple." And then they'd be like, "Okay, let me like test your qualifications. Like, do you know Torah and like all this stuff and blah 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 blah." And they do all of this stuff, and then once you pass those qualifications, they're like, "Okay, you can join me, and you're qualified enough to like become my disciple." What Jesus is doing here is very unusual, and is a radical switch of that, where he's going to someone who probably pretty explicitly doesn't know the Torah all that well, right? Because he's a fisherman. And so he very much a commoner. And he goes to them and says, "Do you want to be my disciples?" And so it's a reversal of the whole system. And it's a picture of this idea of that God initiates and then we respond, right? Which is just like already with the beginning of what he's doing in his ministry, he's already reversing and upending traditional like status hierarchy setups that were in place from the culture and how it worked. You also have again, it's mentioning Simon Peter, and a lot of people think that this is, we already talked about this like last week, but they think that this is like his kind of like the gospel according to him. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about is very specifically what Jesus says. Follow me, and I will make, or I will make you become fishers of men. Right. So what he's doing here, right, is he's taking people with a very practical set of skills and he's calling them into a spiritual practice where they are hopefully going to be where it like symbolically they're going to be using similar skills, right? And so it's the spiritualization process, taking something concrete and material and making it spiritual. And this is a thing that Jesus does a lot, right? And we're pretty familiar with this, and we like as modern day Christians, we're aware of this, and where we'll be like, okay, like they did the things in the Old Testament because that was like they did animal sacrifices and all this stuff. Well, now we don't have to do that, and sacrifices kind of got spiritualized away a little bit by like Jesus' sacrifice, right? And there are a lot of these rules in the Old Testament that give us these kind of like different patterns of behavior and everything, but they kind of get spiritualized a little bit. Now, well, definitely going on here and is true, there's also a way that we can take that too far, right? And it makes sense as to why like Gnosticism became a problem, right? It's not like we're the first people to notice this spiritualizing aspect of like what Jesus is doing in a lot of places. But the problem is whenever you do the Gnostic thing and you apply it to absolutely everything to the point where you say all material is bad, so much so that Jesus didn't even have a body, and everybody that does have a body is like terrible and sinful. And so the only way to like become like cleansed is to just like not have a body, right? Yeah, basically. And as soon as you start going that far, you over spiritualize everything, and you lose the balanced vision of heaven meeting earth that has been set up and that we talked about so much while going over Genesis. That's what like the whole story is. And so if you don't, this is one of the dangers, right, of if you divorce what Jesus is doing from the Old Testament and the Old Testament message, then it's very easy to get into the mindset of just saying, oh, well, look, we have an example of Jesus doing that. We have an example of Jesus spiritualizing something. Therefore, we do that everywhere, and we ignore the Old Testament, and we spiritualize the crap out of everything, and we just we project everything that we want. And I think that actually is, I actually think that that's kind of one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of the modern problems that we are, is because that emphasis of ignoring the material and spiritualizing everything has leaked into the common culture, right? And it's why you have this issue of like, you can identify as whatever you want because whatever material you are doesn't matter. Like just the inner essence is the only thing that matters. And so it's not defined by anything. And so it can be whatever it is that you want. And as soon as you start to like unmoor yourself from the reality, it's like a very weird way of trying to have like your own like transcendence, right? So that was all I had to say about that. Questions, comments?
Yeah. So with Simon Peter and his brothers, right?
Yeah.
Did they know who Jesus was, or was Jesus just this random guy who yelled at them?
Who yelled at them? Yeah. So like in Mark, he's a random guy that yelled at them. In the other Gospels, probably not.
What? What?
The other one, yeah. Exactly, right? So, like, again, right? And this is my point.
Wait
That,
until Matthew said it.
right. So my point is like
You got 6 months.
in this, right, from the way that everything is set up, right? And if we're reading this for the first time, it very much looks like that they don't really know who he is, right? Again, if you go and read the other gospels, they're around actually at the baptism, so they hear this. There's actually some there's some reason to believe that possibly some of the disciples actually started off as disciples of John, and then after like Jesus took over, they like converted and like became disciples of Christ. So there's some people that go with that theory. And then of course in the other gospels, there's a lot more of a like there's more of a discussion that goes on in this whole like follow me thing, right? So like there's like the story of like where he goes, and I think he like recruits like Nathaniel or something like that. And he's like, and everybody's like, we found the Messiah, here he is. And he's just like, he's not the Messiah. And like Jesus says some kind of line about like I saw you sitting under like the fig tree before like before like your brother came and like talked to you or something like that. And he's like, oh, well, I was sitting under a fig tree. Whoa, crazy. Like you got it. And like all this stuff. So in this, it seems like no. But yeah. Anything else? All right. We'll keep going.
And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit.
All right. So I actually want to talk about this little section first. So a couple things. One, the synagogue in Capernaum, they actually they have found like the remains of a synagogue there, and a lot of people think that like this is like probably the same synagogue. So you can like go and visit it. Another thing again, so like he just shows up, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So what is that like? What does that mean that he taught as one with authority and not as one as the scribes?
The scribes were just like listing off the things that are already written down, like he was saying, like slightly newer stuff. Or
No, what it was is actually very similar to what I do now, right? So what the scholars were doing something similar to what I do now, which is where they're like, we take a thing and we say, Rabbi so-and-so said this about this. Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said this about this. Discuss amongst yourselves, right? There was a lot of, there was a lot of like, we don't know definitively what the answer is to like how this thing should be taken and interpreted. And so instead, we look at all of these other sources and have it like point there. What Jesus is doing is very decidedly not that. Jesus is showing up and he's like, this is what the scripture means, blah, 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 blah. And so because of that, it's a lot of people by surprise, right? And personally, I find this very interesting, because I think that what happens then is because this is what's going on. A lot of people in the church now think that means, oh, well, then that means we should teach like Jesus, and we should walk around and we're ones of authority. This is what it is. This is what it is. This is what it is. And what it ends up being is you have a lot of people that speak very authoritatively, but they say a bunch of nonsense. And so there's a level of truth and understanding and humility that comes from how the scholars are taught. And this is one of the things that I think people miss a lot whenever they read the Gospels, is everybody just wants to paint the Pharisees as the boogeyman. Like the Pharisees are the worst of the worst. No, that's not true. It's not like the Pharisees and the Sadducees are the worst in the world. They have a lot of problems and they do a lot of things wrong, and they are hypocrites. And so Jesus rightly, in a number of locations, calls them out on it. But on the other hand, there's a number of times where Jesus is like, the Pharisees are correct. You should listen to the Pharisees. He at one point said, do as the Pharisees do, not as, or do as the Pharisees say. Don't do as they do, because in their actions, they are hypocrites. But what they teach about the law largely is correct. And so you have this weird dichotomy of and balanced view that Jesus is trying to put forward about who are essentially his like religious enemies, right? Where he's like, no, there's a level of what they're doing that's correct, and you need to honor that. And in our time frame, we get so hung up on like attacking the religious authorities. I think it's like PTSD from being Protestant, like coming out of like it's a 300-year PTSD where we're just like, we need to beat up on Catholics. Like, screw you, Catholics, you're Pharisees. And it's like,
It's
it's generational curse that we just need to break it off of them. And it's like no, like there's a level of what they're doing that is like correct and right, and we need to be able to recognize that, while at the same time being like, okay, a lot of the other stuff that they do is wrong, so we need to have wisdom and discernment about analyzing those things. You don't really see Jesus calling out the other scribes or other scholars for how they're teaching. That's not what he's doing. He's just teaching differently because he's in a position to teach differently. And as we're going to see, the whole reason why that little portion, right? The whole reason why that portion is stuck where it is because this entire thing is about, or this little passage, the correct term is like periscope, which is a weird thing because it's like you imagine a periscope, but like the technical term for like a kind of like block of text that's all united together is like a periscope. The whole point of this little periscope is it's talking about what sort of authority does Jesus have. And that's the question that's being put forth because, right, he just called these disciples. Who's he to call these disciples? Like he seems like a nobody. Why does he get to have disciples? Well, we're about to find out.
Also,
And he
they just let him walk into the synagogue and teach everybody.
Yes, because apparently that was like a thing. Was like it was a very like it was,
Open mic night.
yeah, like the Sabbath was.
I mean, that does seem to be how
The synagogue seemed very open.
Jewish culture actually worked at the time, because that's
Yeah.
what Paul would then later do.
Yeah, the Sabbath is very open mic day, right? Like that's what it is. And a lot of like, and this is part of why they had like this whole thing about like you have these like multiple scholars and you have multiple views, and like you would have people that would be they would be like a disciple of like one like dude for like a little bit of time, like learn his stuff, like what he said, right, and then go and like to a different one and like kind of learn from like multiple like people, and then they would come in and be like, oh, these are what all these different people like say, and they had a culture of how that whole thing worked, because again, like I try to reference, in a lot of ways, the kind of underlying ethos of like Jewish and Israelite culture is it's a rather one of decentralization. they're very like a decentralized group. They have they at the same time they have this strong sense of unity, but they also have this strong sense of we probably shouldn't put like one person in charge. And so instead, we're going to have this decentralized system where it's kind of open. And like you see that in Judges. And that's why whenever the monarchy comes around, they're having all these problems and prophets start like slapping kings around and saying like, stop doing everything that you're doing. Like you're screwing everything up. Right. And so they have this kind of, for lack of a better term, decentralizing spirit and how they run their organizations. So as far as I can tell, it's what it looks like to me.
Cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere, throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee.
Okay. So wanted to end there because again, you have that nice like book-ended thing, question about the authority, right? So the authority is linked to the fact that one, that they see this level of authority in the teaching, but then that level of authority is validated in the casting out of the spirits. A couple of interesting things about the casting out of the unclean spirits. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Jesus of Nazareth. The spirit doesn't know why Jesus is there. Okay, this is like important to get. You can also see this in this show up in like other places, in other stories in Mark, in other places in the other Gospels. The spirits don't really know what Jesus is doing there, right? This lets us know a couple things. One, they're not omniscient, right? They don't know the plan of God. So there's a level of secrecy about what God is doing against the forces of darkness. And personally, for me, I think that that's super, super important because we like to, as Christians, we like to rag on like people in this like time period, right? When we're reading the Gospels, like, how could they have been so stupid that they thought the Messiah was going to come and like beat up the Romans and like do all of this stuff, and they didn't. They're so silly. And how could they not? Didn't they read the prophecies? Wouldn't they have known all of this stuff? And it's like, don't we also make this claim that like the demons know about like the scriptures better than like even like humans do because they have longer time to like go through it, and yet they don't even know what Jesus is doing? And so like if any like kind of beings would know what God is doing, it would be them. And so why are we giving crap to all of the disciples and everybody else for getting it wrong about what Jesus would be doing if the spiritual entities also are very confused about what he's doing? And if that's the case, and then that's how old prophet, like we get to see in the Gospels, it's really interesting. We get to see how Old Testament prophecy gets fulfilled in real time, while at the same time seeing people's reaction to it being filled out and or fulfilled in real time. So because of, if that's the case, why do we think that when we read texts like Revelation, that we know 100% this is exactly what is going to happen, right? Like, we already have pretty clear examples of certain levels of prophecy that the people at the time were like, we believe this is going to be fulfilled. But then as it's being fulfilled, they don't recognize it. And so my point to make with all this is not that we can't have a general idea of how prophecy and like future prophecies and prophecies in Revelation might be fulfilled or what that might look like. We can do that to a certain extent, but we need to be humble and recognize that we're probably not going to get it to 100%, because if we could get it 100%, it might actually mean that there is something that, like, it's not clear, but it might mean that there is something that like the supernatural forces of darkness could possibly do to like mess that plan up, right? And it seems to be that that's kind of the thing that is like going on in the background of like the gospel story, is like the supernatural evil forces are trying to stop Jesus and what he's doing. And so because of that, because of that, that's like kind of why the ultimate thrust of like the blame for why he ends up on the cross like gets put onto like evil forces of darkness, right?
Because they didn't know that the cross is like the weapon against them.
Exactly. And that point.
I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say that the demons and the spirits know the scriptures. If anything, I will just hear that the evil one, that Satan.
That like
Yeah,
Satan one.
okay.
Well, yeah, and so like
I'm not going to impose any hierarchy that I might suggest as to, oh well, Satan left these guys.
Sure, and I admit that I'm making a little bit of like a jump there.
Who's to
Right.
say these demons just weren't kind of just like a goof, you know? And
They were the cronies.
these are the crony demons that
these guys did
they
not-
don't show up to
What's
synagogue,
up,
and
They didn't study very well.
although this one is literally trying to show up to synagogue, and actually if he does
This
show up
guy
to
has
synagogue,
some nerve.
maybe this guy does actually know a little bit because he shows up.
Is it possible he's playing dumb? As a
Could-
joking question and almost a serious question.
Oh, tone. We weren't there. Was that whole thing extremely sarcastic?
I mean,
We don't know what
We-
you're doing.
yeah. So we I mean, like, we
Jesus,
don't know.
What are you doing here?
My guess would be like either way, whatever it is, right? So like Jesus' response, right, is to tell him to shut up.
Kill me. Sorry, just kidding.
What are you gonna do? Pick me out of this body?
Yeah. But and it seems to be that so throughout like the rest of this chapter, there's going to be this connection between talking about Jesus and revealing who he is that's connected with his fame, right? And so you have this incident occur, and then it says that once his fame spread everywhere throughout all of Galilee. And of course, we, like, with our mindset and how we think, we are like, oh, that's a good thing, right? But it kind of sets up that it's not really a good thing.
And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. And the whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him.
Okay. So You'll read this a lot if you read like any like kind of commentaries on Mark about the word like immediately. So like it shows up twice here. I guess in total the word immediately shows up like dozens and dozens of times. I can't remember if it's like 40 or like 70 or something like that. Like it's like all over the book. And it's again kind of lending to that tone of like thing happens. There's a pace to the story because there's a trajectory and an endpoint that like Mark is trying to get to. And so like thing happens, and you don't hear so much about what Jesus' interactions are in any one given situation. But so let's go over this for a little bit. So one thing, who gets healed? Simon's mother-in-law. All right. So Peter has a mother-in-law. If Peter has a mother-in-law, that means he has a what?
Wife.
A wife, which means he has a house.
So if you,
Yeah,
you don't
sorry.
know.
Yeah, you're up. Don't worry about that one.
Okay.
That one doesn't matter. So the I mean, he probably does have a house. But this is important, right? This is important because there are, and there's later references to his mother-in-law, but this just goes to, because right, you have, again, let's beat up on the Catholics a little bit, right? The whole like priest shouldn't be married, right? And on one hand, like I understand why they have that as like a practice, and there's a they try to draw it from Paul, and they try to go so far as to say that the disciples don't have any, that none of the disciples have wives. And what they'll say, though, to make sense of this, is they'll say, oh, well, they were previously married. Once they but once they became disciples, they like they stopped being married, which it's not clear. I'm sure you'll find different people that say like different things on like the specifics of that. I have seen some people say that that they maybe while they're being disciples, they temporarily stop being married, as in like they just, you know, like they like both them and their like wives decide to be celibate for a little period for a period of time, because that idea does get referenced in Paul, where he's like, you guys can be like celibate for a period of time, but then like come back together like after like after some time. And so like some people think that that is what's going on with Peter, but then some are just like, yeah, they like either divorced or annulled, or the wife died, but he's still trying to honor the like mother-in-law. That's sketchy to me. I think it makes the most sense that it probably just that he probably just is married, because there is literally a line where Paul says, or somebody says like
Peter was married.
like we all have, well, he's like, we have a right to bring along a believing wife like Peter and the other apostles. And so that implies that not only does Peter have a believing wife, but the other apostles also have a believing wife.
Also, it just seems kind of strange for Jesus to be like, you know, anyone
great.
can be part of the kingdom, but I'm going to select people who are single.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so weird.
Yeah, it is
They're a little more special than you guys.
yeah, there's a disconnect there. Well, I accidentally hit a button and lost where I was, so I'm just gonna read the next part.
Pardon?
One of the things okay, so one of the things that I wanted to suggest that you guys look at is Dr. Heiser talked about him a lot in the Genesis Bible study. But if you go to the Naked Bible podcast, which is his website, and you go to episode 87, he's got an episode that's entitled Exorcism of Demons as part of the Messianic Profile. And what he's talking about that in there is that, okay, there is nowhere in the Old Testament that says that the Messiah will cast out demons. It is not listed anywhere in the Old Testament as one of the things that the Messiah will do. So how come in all the Gospels, Jesus left and right is casting out demons, and it seems to be associated with a level of him establishing his authority as the Messiah? Why is that the case? The reason is because that is a development that came up and was a popular belief and prediction that was made by Second Temple Jewish writings. So there's a variety of other Second Temple writings that depict both David and Solomon as being wise men that could cast out demons. And so because of that, the Messiah, as being a part of the Davidic line, that's going to be in the line of David, part of the thing that identifies the Messiah as being of the Davidic line is, like his forefathers, he's going to be able to cast out demons. Okay. You can listen to that episode and other ones like it where he talks about that and he goes over some of those things. So like one of them that he talks about specifically in that podcast is there is so if you learn the difference between the Septuagint, right? And if you remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic texts are kind of the main version of the Hebrew Bible that we use for translations today. I think I'm getting this correct. I don't know if I wrote it down properly. Yeah, actually, I didn't write it down at all. Anyways, in the Masoretic text, there's 150 Psalms, which is why if you go to our Psalms, there's 150 Psalms. In the Septuagint, there's 151 Psalms. And
lost song.
there's like a lost psalm. In that extra psalm, it talks about, I believe it talks about Solomon casting out demons. And so that's one of the things where people are like, okay, they probably had like some like they and remember also, if you know when the Septuagint was written, Septuagint is written like 200-300 years like before Christ, right? So it's still like a prophecy, but it's not necessarily a part of what a lot of people call like the standard or earliest versions of the Hebrew Bible. But there's also some stuff like Book of Enoch and all that kind of stuff.
So
where
do
junk like that is
the
that.
Apothecaries speak about it? Wait,
I don't know who you're trying to reference.
the books that we took out,
The Apocrypha.
the Apocrypha.
I don't know. It would need to be the Old Testament Apocrypha. I don't know.
Maybe it's in the Book of Mormon.
Actually, it's probably not in the Book of Mormon. I mean, it might be. I don't know.
If it is,
I'm gonna be honest. Haven't read the Book of Mormon, so don't really plan to.
Let's do a bingo card. What's in the Book of Mormon?
What's in there? Yeah.
Also, does it say anything about Jesus multiplying food or changing food or water and other?
Ooh, is that a
consumable
specific
substances?
prediction? I don't think there's a specific thing about that. Not that I
No,
know
it's
of.
easy to argue that that's not as important or grand as exorcism, but a miracle is a miracle.
Yeah, and also,
And he feeds 5,000.
but this is
Doesn't-
going off on a
doesn't
tangent.
exercise
The
hard
point of
knowledge.
that miracle is it's Jesus's version of the manna, right? It's his way of providing for the people of Israel. He's providing food for the people of Israel, but then he always takes that to like a step further, and that's where he gets into the I am the bread of life, and really I'm the manna, right? So it's that relationship between like a practical level, like it's practical level miracle, but differentiated with there's a higher truth of that, which is that like, I am the manna, and I need to be eaten by all of these people, right? So
But yeah, I was just wondering if that would be a easy and valid counter argument to people saying that. Oh well, it doesn't say anything about bread and wine. You know?
yeah, there are other
It's
ones.
just a thought.
Well, I don't think that's. I don't point that out to say that that's like a. I don't know of anybody saying that's
It's
a criticism.
criticism.
It's not really a criticism of the New Testament. It's just a like. It's like a quirk of the New Testament. To like, what's going on there, right? I don't think there'd be. I don't think there'd be any Jew that would be like, "Oh, he's not the Messiah because he cast out demons," like, or some other person.
Specifically to multiplying bread and being like manna is different, but there are plenty of references to bread and wine.
Oh yeah,
in the Old
sure.
Testament, because you get like Passover as well, just like
I
the
don't
entire
know.
Passover.
Mentions, I mean prophecies. Though.
Well, yeah, but the picture of Passover is a prediction of like how communion would take. And Mike Winger's got a video too on how that whole pretty much the entire action of the ritual of Passover is like a prediction for Jesus as well.
The kind of the things that I wanted to say is I skipped over this. So in relationship to whenever Jesus tells like the demon to shut up, and again he's doing it again here, right? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him, and right, and he told all of them to not say who he is. I don't think that this is the main point of that lesson, but I think there's like a tangentially important lesson for people that are like really heavy in like apologetics and like scholarship study of Bible, which is that simply knowing God and simply knowing Jesus and knowing who he is isn't enough. There is a loyalty aspect that's important there, right? Because the demons know who Jesus is. They know that he's the Holy One. They know his position, but they are not loyal to him. And so because of that, they get cast out. And like, if you are not loyal to Jesus and you are not a part of his plan, it doesn't matter that you identify him. It doesn't give you, and that's actually kind of an important point that we think about, is that there's this whole level, and we've talked about it before, with like kind of like folklore understanding of like the name, right? Like if you know the name of like a person, like you have power over them, right? And so like, oh, I have the name over, I know your name, therefore I have power over you. They know Jesus's name, but it doesn't give them any power over Jesus, right? And so even that, like that level of them being able to identify him isn't enough to overcome his power. So this is like an important thing to remember. It's an important thing for like, if you're just, I feel like it's important for like me to remember, because, okay, just because like I study this stuff all the time, it doesn't mean that I'm always following after him the way that I should, or showing like my loyalty to him the way that I should. And like, I need to make sure that I remember that. So that's all I was thinking of with that.
Do you think one of the reasons that Jesus told the demons to be quiet and shut up was so that they wouldn't go out and tell the other demons that he's there?
He seems to tell that to everybody.
Plausible. He seemed to tell to everybody,
Yeah.
but semi plausible. So we'll keep going.
I meant to mention this in that last paragraph.
Yeah.
Just the whole how it just comes out and says that the demons are well acquainted with the name of Jesus, and how obviously the name of Jesus does not appear in the Testament. And so I'm wondering, I guess, what are people's ideas on, because like you said, I mean, we know the demons, they're not omniscient, but
Right.
they know an extent. They know that this Jesus guy exists and it has the power of creators.
They have some means of being able to identify where they knew that they identify him, right? And that's the whole point of like talked about is like the whole running through line tone of like this whole thing. He's like, who is this Jesus guy? And the people that seem to really know who he is are these demons. And they straight up are like, you're the Holy One of God. You're Jesus of Nazareth. Like they say exactly who he is. They don't mince words about it. How do they know that? Again, to me, the only thing that makes sense within the context of Mark is what happens prior, which is Jesus goes out into the wilderness and kicks Satan's butt. Right? And so really the only way that he would have that the other demons would have, like, maybe they can just somehow sense it. Maybe that's a possibility. I don't know.
Maybe they heard
But
about
maybe they heard about what happened with that. And I would think that if the person that's at the top of your hierarchy gets defeated by another person, everybody else is going to hear about it, right? Like everybody else that's part of it is going to hear about it. And so
That didn't even occur to me.
that's what
But yeah, but just based on how like a lot of times how like a chapter would end in Genesis and then it would seem like a completely new story and a new idea comes up in the next chapter. But really, if you take 2 seconds to think about it, it's like, oh, this is kind of
like how are these connected? Yeah.
I mean, there's also like, I don't think that that the demons or spiritual forces at the time needed like an event necessarily to prove to them who Jesus was.
Maybe not.
And so like this is biblical headcanon.
Yeah, it is.
But frequency with which he's running into demons during his ministry, there's a good enough chance that just walking around the planet for 30 years, like a demon could have seen him and like been able to identify.
Well,
him
there's
or something.
Well,
Why? Well, because it might not be like a thing that he needs to prove to them. It might just be obvious in some way.
This also goes to, so there's another option here that's related to the they can just sense it thing, which is that, again, if we go back to Genesis, right, you have this level of understanding that the spiritual world kind of superimposed upon like the physical world, and like they're not the same exact thing. But right, you can look out and go, oh, this is God's camp. Oh, there's a ladder going to heaven, right? And there's spiritual forces moving around in the world. And so if they are a spiritual force, they might be able to see things that regular humans cannot see. And so maybe when they look at Jesus, he looks different than what the way that a human, right? They have a scouter on, and they can see that his power level is over 9,000.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, oh my gosh, right? So like
he's up to it, just rises. This guy's got some breath. This guy is the breath.
Oh, whoa. Yeah, so that's a feasible alternate like headcanon of how this works to me. Yeah, because we have other things again in other parts of the Bible that kind of speak to that sort of a thing.
I'm gonna go with
being
your
a
answer
thing.
that you extracted from the text and move on.
Yeah, I like that one better too. But I'm saying, look, again, I'm saying there are multiple options here. Sue me. I'm not Jesus. I don't know what it is. I can't teach with a new authority. I have a limited amount of authority. All right.
Because like the demons, potentially all the fallen demons were once. It's not like Satan created any demons of his own. All the demons he has were fallen angels. So they all saw God at one point. So I don't know. They'd somehow be able to recognize something in what they saw of God.
That was kind of my
The
initial
face of
thought.
God.
The big thing, though, to me, and again, why I needed to posit, like, okay, they ran into Jesus in physical form earlier because he's called out as Jesus of Nazareth, not simply Son of God, the Holy One.
Yeah.
And if that were it, then okay, they have a radar, like a ping or something
Yeah.
of like who it is. But like the Jesus of Nazareth is like, okay, that's only been a thing for
30 years.
30 years
Yeah.
now.
Well,
decades,
and
so-
also one of the other things I forgot to mention this. Actually, the Jesus of Nazareth thing is interesting just from a historical standpoint. In the idea of you always hear this thing about like Nazareth being like a backwater. One of the reasons why we know that that is the case, that like it was a backwater, is the fact that we have maps from the time period, and Nazareth isn't on them, right? And it's not that like it didn't exist. It's just that if a town is super small, you don't write it on the map. Who cares? It's a super small town. They have those all over the place. It isn't until like the later like first century, mostly because of of Christians always talking about Jesus of Nazareth, that they started putting Nazareth on maps. And like it's not until like late first century that like, you know,
It's like no one cares about Tupelo, Mississippi, and then there's a guy Elvis is born on. somehow.
and then bam, now it's important. Right.
Jesus
Exactly.
literally put Nazareth on the map. Is that
Pretty
what you're
much,
saying?
yeah.
Okay.
Also, one of the thoughts I had was
And it's also why Jesus of Nazareth is a very distinct name, because pretty much nobody else would be known as Jesus of Nazareth.
No one would dare call themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. I mean, once they know that he was from Nazareth, is it possible that they like picked up on the whole Christmas birth thing, like the whole like the prophecy and the wise men, but they weren't able to like interfere in that?
I think that's beyond the scope of Mark because it's not even like listed in there.
Probably.
So
It's
yeah, I don't know, but there's definitely that element of like trying to make all of those different prophecies work in the other gospels. But let's keep going. And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And he said to them, "Let us go to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogue and casting out demons. So we have this idea of he's casting out demons, he's healing people. Those two things should at the same time both be connected and also differentiated, right? And so we shouldn't think that it's all sickness, it's all material sickness. We shouldn't think that it's every single time someone is sick that it's a demon. There is some overlap there. We don't know, and it's not clear as to what that overlap is. So it's okay to think that sickness is just as sickness, while also being cognizant of the fact that there can also be demons out there. At the same time that that's going on, and that is being, and this is important with what Jesus says, that is going on, right? And I said, the reason why that is happening is because that is validating what he's saying, right? That's validating that new teaching of authority. But with this right here, let us go out to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. What's going on is people are coming to him to get more of the casting out of the demons and of the healing. And what Jesus says is, we're done with that. I've already proven my authority. I don't need to keep doing that. What's important is that I go out and preach, because that is why I came out. The whole reason why I am doing this is to get the gospel out there, to get the message of why I am here, because that's the actual goal. And I think it's very common for people to get that mixed up. And people think that we preach so that people are healed. No, you heal so that people get preached to, because that is the ultimate healing. The gospel is the ultimate healing. You can go through your entire life with no legs, and it's fine because you have the gospel. That's where the priority lies. And in fact, if it's becoming an issue where so many people are coming for healing and casting out demons, Jesus goes, I'm moving away from this place because that's not my goal. And that's a big shift change from how we think. And
Can you say that reference again? What chapter is that in Mark?
it's first Mark. We haven't gotten very far.
Okay.
It's chapter 1 of Mark.
Okay, my
This wasn't
bad.
here last week.
You weren't here last
I wasn't
week.
here.
This is chapter 1 of Mark.
Okay.
The verse is 35,
Okay, sorry.
right? It says, they say, everyone is looking for you. Why are they looking for him? Because of the stuff that happened earlier, which is he's casting out demons and he's healing. And he says, we're going to leave.
I got you.
And as he goes, though, he's preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So it's not like he stopped, right? He still kept doing that, but the goal is the preaching, right? Okay. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, keep this going. I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus suddenly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer him for your cleansing what Moses commanded him for a proof to them. And he went out and began to talk freely about it and spread the news so that Jesus no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every corner. So again, now we have it explicitly stated why the fame thing was a problem. Jesus could no longer openly enter a town. He couldn't get into the heart of the town where he wanted to be so that he could get into where the synagogues were and preach, right? So, yes, exactly. It's a Beatlemania issue. Also going backward, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer him for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. So, the commentary that I always like to rag on says, so there is in Deuteronomy, there's a specific, like, there's a lot of specific offerings. There's a specific offering for like leprosy. Like if you're cleansed of it, you go and you give this offering and you're like, hey, I've been cleansed of it. And the commentary literally says, this offering has never been given. This would have been the first time that this offering ever would have been performed, and so I'm sure that the priests would have needed to go and look up the scrolls to see exactly what the offering entailed. That's a goofy conclusion. It makes no sense to me to say that in Deuteronomy they would have had this like prescription of how this situation was to be handled, and that it just never happened for hundreds of years. I think it's a very goofy thing to. I think it's a very goofy conclusion that you're making, because what you're doing is you're taking the scientific understanding that leprosy is a lifelong disease and that there's no known cure, and so because of that, no one was ever cured from it until Jesus showed up. That's a weird circular reasoning to come to that conclusion that therefore no one had ever paid this thing before. I don't think that that's what the text is trying to teach at all. Instead, what I think the text is trying to teach is the thing that I said earlier, which is that Jesus is not coming to like replace the law, right? He's not going to replace he's not coming to condemn, I guess would be a better thing. He's not coming to condemn what they're doing. He's like, you've been cleaned of this. God has cleaned you of it. Now go do the proper offerings back unto God, like what the Old Testament tells you to do, right? And so it's very similar to that notion that I said earlier about like listen to the Pharisees, do what they tell you, because whenever they're doing what they tell you, they're teaching you God's law. And so we still need to like maintain that. I think that was all that I had for this chapter. Any questions, comments, anything?
So with the law, how much of it are like modern Christians expected to follow?
Okay, so
We're
that
allowed to eat pork.
so that's a really big question, which we're not really going to be able to answer tonight, or really even in Mark, because it doesn't really get dealt with properly in Mark. It's dealt with more properly in the rest of the New Testament. And again, like this is like this is supposed to be the gospel according to Peter, right? Peter's the one that has the dream about the foods and about being unclean. And Peter is also the one that immediately recognizes, more importantly, that dream is not just about food. He immediately recognizes that dream is about people, and he interprets it that way. And he goes, oh, this means that the people that we classify as unclean and as Gentiles are no longer supposed to just like be seen as that. We are supposed to bring them in. And so because of that, they necessarily have to drop certain aspects of
The law.
of the Old Testament law. And so if you're going to be consistent, like you have to have that. You then get into actually like the book that I just finished like my paper on for school, actually Friday, was literally like a large portion of that book was exactly this question, because it was Old Testament ethics. And so it was about how do you take Old Testament ethics and how does it get applied to Christians? And there's a lot of different views on that. Basically, the view that I like the best is that ultimately Christ is, it's not that Old Testament law is invalid or doesn't matter. It's just that law has been fulfilled in Christ. So because of that, any requirements on the law, if we have proper, again, like I said, not just knowing who Jesus is, but loyalty to him, which we have talked about in this, if you have loyalty to Christ, then your requirements for the law are fulfilled, right? And so what that then means is that the law becomes what is called a paradigmatic tool for helping us know what are good principles to live by. So what you end up doing is you end up looking at the Old Testament. You analyze, okay, not just what this law is, right? But what was this law doing in Israel at the time? Why did Israel have it as a law? How was it functioning in their cultural context and their understanding? Like, for example, so like very easily, you can take like the no tattoos law, right? If you just say, oh, Israel had no tattoos, therefore we don't have tattoos. Okay. If that's what you think is going on, you're very clearly missing like the point of the passage and what's happening. It like that law about the no tattoos and about not cutting the flesh had a very specific function in what it was doing in the Israelite community. And that's because tattoos had a very specific function of how they worked in the wider world. And so it was separating Israel from that wider world context of how they were using it. And so what you then have to talk about that, and then you can transplant it into our modern context and go, okay, so what would be a wise way for us to handle like tattoos in the modern world? And so that's like a very quick thing, but it becomes complicated as you try to like break it down. But I think that's the best way to do it.
Plus, tattoo artists were terrible back then, so it just wasn't working.
It just wasn't working because they all look bad. Yes.
Might not have been sanitary.
No, it had more to do with idolatry. It had more to do with idolatry and people's disposition towards their gods, because it was all about trying to buy the gods' favor in exchange for altering your body. So what you were doing was you were branding yourself with their with something about them, with their sign, or you were cutting yourself in order to show your devotion
Almost
to
a bit
them.
of like a sacrifice.
It was a form of sacrifice,
Yeah.
right? And so there's a way in which, in my opinion, that sort of a thing can go on with tattoos, specifically in the modern world, right?
Mhm.
So it's like, if you're like, so like, for example, it's like, if you're using a tattoo, like, I mean, I guess like the most explicit one would be like, okay, if you get like a big like satanic pentagram like on your chest or something like that, right? It's like, okay, that's not a good idea, right? Like don't do that. And there can be other things too. Like I would actually argue that like, if it's just a thing that you like, right? Like there's a lot of people that are just like, oh, I really like video games or something like that, and they get like a Zelda Triforce thing or whatever. I would say like, maybe don't do that. Like maybe don't put something that is a fun pastime on the same level as like something that your body needs to honor, right? Like that's maybe too high for like just a pastime, right? But again, the way that we deal with it as Christians is like, just because someone has a Triforce tattoo doesn't mean that you're like going to go to hell, right? And it doesn't mean that you're like a corrupted individual. It just means that it might not be like the wisest thing for you to do.
Worship princess or goddess Hylia like that. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But
then, like, for instance, if the game impacted you on like a personal level, like, oh yeah, this game helped me through this thing.
You need more friends.
and like right, and so like,
I'm just gonna say it.
it's not that
I'm getting
people
this
can't-
tattoo in an effort to get more friends.
it's not that people can't make like
No.
a case for it, right? Like I think that it's like arguable that a person could make a case for it, because like again, like the Bible says there's a time and place for activity, so like maybe that includes getting Triforce tattoos, right? And so like, but I do
Some tattoos are okay because they like put scriptures on themselves.
sure, but and again, like even like I think, and in the same way that I can say that I think that there's a way in which someone could like have a Triforce tattoo and it'd be like an okay like thing to do. I actually think that there's a way in which someone could like put a scripture tattoo on themselves and it actually not be a good thing for them to do.
So
Yeah,
much
right.
depends on the heart and what yours intended.
Like they're
Yeah.
and there's so much that goes like deep into that like, for practical purposes, like another person is almost never in a position to be able to tell somebody whether or not that's a good idea, which is part of the reason why like a lot of times whenever it comes to any of this stuff, and I'm not just talking about like tattoos or like anything else, I'm like, kind of better to just err on the side of caution and be like, it's maybe unwise unless you like really think about it and can like come up with like a good like explanation. Be like, okay, this is be very conscious and intentional for like why you're doing it, which is part of the reason why like I really liked, maybe you never heard this, but because like I got this from Pastor Kurt whenever he was here, about tattoos specifically, which was what he said, and I've always liked this, and I've never really heard it. What he said was, he was like, because
He said you should get a tattoo.
this was his advice in while being a youth pastor, which was, okay, if you want to get a tattoo, write out what it is exactly, and maybe even like draw it or get somebody like to draw it, get like size, positioning, and everything, know exactly where you want it on your body and like all that stuff, and like mark it down, and then wait at least a year. And at the end of that year, if you've changed anything about the tattoo, size, position, where you want it, what it says, anything like that, redesign it, and then wait
Another year.
and wait another year. And once you've gotten a full year where you haven't changed it, go ahead and get the tattoo. And I think that's a really smart like rule of thumb, because like if you can't be hypothetically satisfied with it for a year, you're not going to be satisfied with it in actuality for your whole life, right? Like, of course you're not. And so like I really liked that rule of thumb, and it was one of the things that like I'll always remember, that like he like said that in a sermon. But yeah, I'll end it there.